Is China witnessing another Tiananmen moment? People are on the streets calling for President Xi Jinping to step down, calling for an end to the Communist Party's regime. Now, this is unheard of. Look at what happened in Shanghai over the weekend. The people of Shanghai are calling for freedom. It's deja vu for the Chinese Communist Party, which is haunted by this word, freedom. Remember, the CCP quashed calls for freedom back in 1989 in Tiananmen Square. But decades later, the echoes can be heard once again, this time in China's commercial capital. Shanghai residents are calling for Xi Jinping to step down, for the party to give up power. Words like these have not been heard on China's streets since Tiananmen. It's a rare rebuke, and it's all too real. The protests have now spread to all major cities of China: Beijing, Wuhan, Guangzhou, Chengdu, Xi'an. On Sunday, a crowd gathered in Chengdu. People held up blank sheets of paper. They chanted, "We don't want lifelong rulers." Many were heard shouting, "Freedom of press, freedom of speech."
Make China great again!
Meanwhile, in Wuhan, people smashed through metal barricades, tore down COVID testing tents as they demanded an end to lockdowns. Just look at this. In Lanzhou, people smash COVID testing booths. It's a kind of civil disobedience unseen since Tiananmen. In Beijing, people have been demonstrating for more than 3 days. Over the weekend, many of the protesters were heard shouting, "No PCR test, we want freedom." Some shouted, "We do not want a leader, we want votes. Do not be a slave, be a citizen." These protests were sparked by a building fire in Xinjiang. 10 people died in its capital city of Urumqi. Locals are pinning the blame on zero COVID. They say COVID measures hampered the rescue efforts, and the ambulances reached too late. Remember, students were the backbone of the Tiananmen Square protests. They poured into the streets across Beijing to build pressure on the government. This time, too, it's no different. On Sunday, students gathered in numerous university campuses to challenge the government, to call for an end to the Communist Party regime. Do you see the similarities I'm talking about? The Chinese leadership knows this is exactly how the Tiananmen Square protests culminated. Once again, it's deja vu, one that rattles China.
There were so many obstacles in the way. Obstacles on the way to the building, on the door. The neighborhood is blocked. And when the workers came, when the police came, they could not get into the building immediately. They had to get around all these obstacles and barriers on their way. By the time they arrived, people were already dead. Of course, people were angered by that.
This anger has been contagious. It has spread across China and has brought back to life calls for freedom. Calls for an end to the CCP's authoritarianism. Don't mistake these protests as just an anti-zero COVID demonstration. It's much more than that. This is a culmination of years of frustration being sparked by the fire of Xinjiang. And now history is repeating itself in more ways than one. Some of you already know this. The Tiananmen Square protest began as a memorial. In April 1989, students gathered in Tiananmen Square to mourn CCP veteran Hu Yaoban. On the day of his funeral, the mourners began demanding democratic reform. Back then, the people of China were fed up with inflation, corruption. And now, cut to this weekend. A candlelight vigil was held in Shanghai in memory of the fire victims. Before anyone realized, the crowd began chanting, "End the lockdown." Fists went up in the air, sloganeering followed. Some chanted, "We don't want to be locked, we want freedom." And soon, the scene became eerily similar to what happened in Beijing the year the CCP sent tanks to Tiananmen Square. Clashes with the police followed. Do not forget, this is not Hong Kong, this is mainland China. All of this is happening in mainland China. Under the very nose of Xi Jinping. He's been in power for more than a decade now, and never before has he faced such dissent. Xi thought his biggest hurdle was behind him. He had managed to impress all CCP members at the party congress. With the third term, he thought he had won it all. He had tightened his grip on power. And now was his time to enjoy unlimited power. Be president for life. But these protesters have other plans. They want Xi Jinping to go. They are talking freedom, free press, votes, ballots. They are holding a blank paper to Xi Jinping, holding him accountable for COVID mismanagement. Try and understand the repercussions of what's happening. This is a country that is obsessed with the idea of obedience, of stability. But now headlines worldwide are talking about the churn in China. Outside too, there are people calling for the country's freedom. Protesters have gathered outside the Chinese embassy in London. Calls for China's freedom were also heard in Sydney, even in Hong Kong, where a group held white sheets of paper and flowers in solidarity with the protesters. Take a look.
This is the first time that you see on the streets of Shanghai people calling down with the CCP or calling Xi Jinping to be out, for example, and that's a major escalation in the struggle in China for democratic rights.
At least Chinese students, most of them don't know what happened 30 years ago. I'm a little bit worried about their freedom may be taken by the government.
Freedom, freedom for China!
Freedom, freedom for China!
Freedom, freedom for China!
Freedom, freedom for China!
The question is, will these protesters manage to do what the demonstrators in Tiananmen could not? Also, how will China respond to this mass movement? Will it roll back the contentious zero-COVID policy? A bigger question, can it even afford to do so? Let me tell you why I'm saying this. Like we have been telling you on the show, there are doubts about the effectiveness of the Chinese vaccines that the state has given to its people. Estimates say less than 60% of China's citizens have received a booster shot. There are also doubts about China's ability to handle a large-scale mess when it comes to COVID-19, a large wave of cases. According to some reports, China has only 4 hospital beds for every 1,000 people. So come a big wave, China's healthcare system would simply collapse. COVID cases have touched a record high once again. And China seems to be in no mood to roll back its COVID policy.
What you mentioned does not reflect what actually happened. China has been following the dynamic zero-COVID policy. We believe that with the leadership of the Communist Party of China and cooperation of the Chinese people, our fight against COVID-19 will be successful.
Well, people in China do not agree. They have lost trust in the administration, in Xi's leadership. Chinese citizens are now looking online for ways to get hold of ventilators and oxygen cylinders. There has been a surge in online searches for these two items. So what's next? Where do these protests go from here? Hong Kong is a breathing example of China's ability to crack down on protests. There's no reason why the government will not use the same template in the mainland too. In fact, the police have already been deployed in Shanghai. Fresh barricades have been laid out. Over the weekend, a BBC reporter was roughed up and detained. Security has been tightened around the country. But here's one thing Tiananmen shows us. When people in China come out in such large numbers, often barricades fail to stop the momentum from growing. Like we just told you, what's happening in China today has an eerie resemblance to what happened back in 1989. This is exactly how the movement in Beijing had culminated. So whether this mass uprising too will walk down the same path, or whether it will culminate into something much bigger, that's something the world will be closely watching. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.